There is a version of this conversation that goes differently. In that version, the power flickers once, comes back on, flickers again, and then stays off. And the family sitting in that living room does not panic, because they already know what is about to stop working, in what order, and what to do about each one.
Seems fine
That
now.
version exists. Most families are just
Did you
not
see that?
living it. This video is about the gap between
the power
those
just
two
went out.
versions. When people
I
think
saw
about
everything.
a blackout, they
The
tend to
evidence
think in
was
simple
irrefutable.
terms.
And
The
I
lights
knew
go out.
in that moment
Maybe
that I
the
had to tell
television
the truth,
turns off.
no matter the cost.
You find some candles, you wait, and eventually the power comes back. That mental model works fine for a 2-hour outage on a Tuesday evening. It does not work at all for an outage that lasts 48 hours, or 72, or longer. And the
looking
reason
back,
it fails is
there were
not
moments
because
of
people are
clarity,
not smart.
even in the
It is
chaos.
because no one ever
We just
explained
had
to
to
them,
listen closely.
clearly and practically,
I saw him that
what
night.
actually happens to a
He was
modern
angry.
home when grid power
He was gonna do
disappears and
something.
does not return quickly.
I tried to stop him,
Your
but he
home is
wouldn't
not a
listen.
collection of appliances. It is a layered system of interconnected functions: heat, cooling, water pressure, communication, food safety, lighting, medical support. And each of those layers depends on electricity in ways that are not always obvious. Some fail immediately. Some fail after a few hours. Some hold on for a day and then collapse at the worst
The
possible
truth is
moment.
always simpler than you
Understanding
think.
that sequence is not just useful
You
knowledge.
just have to be brave enough to
During
see
a
it.
serious outage, it is the difference
to
between
understand
managing
the
a difficult
three
situation
distinct
and being
phases.
blindsided by one.
Phase 1
In this video,
is
we are
data
going to walk
collection.
through 10 things that
I've
stop
seen it
working
firsthand,
first when the
way
power
things
stays
can
off.
shift.
Not the obvious
Trust
ones.
me, we have
The
to
ones
act
that matter
right now.
in the order they
I saw
matter.
things that day that you
With
just
the
wouldn't
details
believe.
most people only discover after
It
they
changed
needed to know
everything for
them.
me.
By the time we reach
had to
number
be
1,
done.
you may realize that the most dangerous failure in a long blackout has nothing to do with food or heat or water. It has to do with something most people
The
never
evidence
even think to
shows,
protect.
without a doubt,
Let us start
that
at number
these
10.
are the 10 key
Number
factors
10 is
that
something
led to the
almost
collapse.
no one considers until they are standing in front of it in the dark, and that is the garage door. This sounds like a minor inconvenience. It is not. In millions of American homes, the primary or only vehicle access point is an automatic garage door, controlled by a
Come on.
motorized opener that
Open.
runs entirely on
Open, you
household
stupid
current.
door.
The moment power goes out,
Nothing.
that opener stops working. Most openers do have a manual release, a red cord hanging from the trolley rail that allows you to disengage the mechanism and lift the door by hand. But here is what nobody tells you.
I've never had to do
After
this
years
before.
of disuse, some of
Are you
those
sure this is
manual
the right
releases
one?
are stiff, corroded, or difficult to
got
operate.
it.
Some garage doors are poorly
Push up.
balanced and extremely
Lift.
heavy when not
Lift.
motor assisted.
Up.
Some people
Come on.
have never once pulled that red cord and genuinely do not know how. And in a real emergency, a house fire, a medical situation, a need to evacuate immediately, standing in front of a door you cannot open while your car sits 20 feet away is not a minor inconvenience. It is a crisis inside a crisis. The 2003 Northeast blackout, which cut power to roughly
Looks like it's the whole
55
block.
million people across 8 states and parts of
wonder
Canada,
how long it'll last this time.
generated thousands of calls to fire departments and emergency services
Send the
from
closest
people who
unit
could
code
not
3.
exit or access
I'm
their
initiating
homes
the trace
through
on the mobile
automatic
line
entry
now.
points.
Get me dispatch on the
The
TAC
fix
channel.
is simple and costs nothing.
You pull down
Find the
firmly
manual
on the
release
red release
cord right
cord.
now, before you need it, and
That
make sure
disengages
every
the
adult in
trolley,
your
freeing
household
the
knows
door.
how to use it. But most families have never done it, which is why it makes this list. Number 9 is the sump pump. And if you have a basement, this one matters more than almost anything else in a multi-day outage. Sump pumps are electric devices installed in a pit at the lowest point of a basement or crawl space. Their entire job is to remove groundwater that collects beneath or around the foundation and pump it away from the house. They run on standard household current. The moment the power goes out, they stop. During normal dry conditions, this is not an immediate problem. But power outages do not occur on a schedule coordinated with weather patterns. Storms that cause flooding also cause outages. Heavy rain that follows several dry days can raise groundwater levels quickly, and a sump pump that is not running during a heavy rain event will allow water to accumulate in that pit until it overflows into the basement. The timeline varies depending on soil saturation, proximity to the water table, and rainfall intensity. But in serious conditions, basement flooding can begin within a few hours of the pump losing power.
It's everywhere.
The damage from a flooded basement during a multi-day outage. Soaked drywall. Destroyed stored goods. Mold growth. Structural issues. Can cost tens of thousands of dollars and take months to remediate. A battery backup sump pump, or a backup system that activates automatically when the primary pump loses power, is one of the highest value preparedness investments available to homeowners in flood-prone areas. FEMA specifically lists sump pump backup systems in its residential flood preparedness guidance.
The projected
Most
budget
homeowners do
comes
not
to
have
exactly
one.
8.
Number
We
8 is harder
anticipate
to
a
see but
significant
affects
shortfall
everyone.
without immediate action.
And it is the internet router. Modern routers run on small AC adapters that draw power from the wall.Cut that power, and within seconds the device
This
powers down,
unprecedented
and
outage
your
has left
home
the
loses
entire
its
eastern
wireless
seaboard
network.
without power.
That means no
We are now
streaming,
getting reports
obviously,
that the situation
but
at the
it also
plant
means no smart home devices, no internet-connected security cameras, no remote monitoring of any kind, and no ability to receive
nothing.
real-time information about
Just
what is
one
happening
bar.
outside your
It's
neighborhood.
gone.
People
No
often
service,
assume their cell phone
nothing.
data will compensate for this.
No,
And in a
no,
short
this can't
outage,
be real.
it usually does.
Oh
But
my
in a
God.
widespread, extended grid
Turn on
failure,
the news.
the kind caused by a major storm, infrastructure damage, or a regional event, cell towers experience massive spikes in demand from everyone in the affected area simultaneously. Towers have backup generators, but those generators hold fuel for roughly 8 to 12 hours under normal load. Under the load of an entire region trying to communicate at once, that window shortens. After the 2021 Texas winter storm, which left more than 4 million households without power, major wireless carriers reported significant degradation or complete outages in affected areas as tower backup power was exhausted. The practical implication
what
is
happened.
this. In an
know
extended
exactly who
blackout,
was
you
involved.
cannot count on having reliable internet or
story needs
cell
to be
service
told.
after the first several hours. Your plan for receiving emergency
get through.
information, contacting family members, and understanding the scope
Nothing?
of the situation
This
needs
is the
to
weather
work
radio.
without those
Simply
tools.
grab the handle, give it
A
a firm
battery-powered
crank,
or
and it will power
hand-cranked
on.
no-way
It's
weather
incredibly
radio
durable
is
and
one of the
built for
most
any
practical
situation.
single investments in this category. It costs under $30 and works entirely without grid power or cell infrastructure. Number 7 is the water heater. And most people do not realize they have already
7.
lost this one by the time they think to check. Gas water heaters seem like they should be immune to power outages because they run on gas. But modern gas water heaters require a small amount of electricity to power the igniter, the thermostat controls, and in many units, the pilot light system. When grid power disappears, these components stop functioning and the heater stops heating water. Hot water in the tank itself stays warm for a few hours depending on insulation quality and ambient temperature. But once it cools, it is gone until power is restored. Electric water heaters are even more direct. They stop entirely the moment the power cuts.
You have to
This
understand
matters for reasons
that
beyond
not every
comfort.
decision is
Hot
clear-cut.
water is essential for basic
Especially
hygiene,
in these
wound
situations.
cleaning, food preparation, and the washing of hands and surfaces in ways that cold water does not fully replicate. In cold climates, the loss of hot water during a winter outage adds another layer of physical stress on top of the loss of heat. After the extended power outages that followed Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017, some of which lasted for months in remote areas. Public health researchers documented significant increases in hygiene-related illness in communities where hot water access was lost. The loss of hot water is rarely the
I
first thing
saw
people
things
think
that
about
night that
when
changed me
preparing for an
forever.
extended outage. It almost
Now,
always becomes one of the
I'm ready
first
to talk
things they
about it.
miss. Number 6 is the
You need to
landline
remember
telephone.
the 6 rules.
And this entry surprises
Don't
people
forget
because
the
many
6.
families assume they no
The
longer
number is
have
6.
one. Or that it no longer matters. Here is why it does. Traditional copper wire landline telephones drew their operating power directly from the phone company's central office through the phone line itself. They did not require household electricity to function. During the 2003 Northeast blackout, while cell networks were overwhelmed and internet connections were down across 8 states, millions of people were still able to make calls on traditional copper wire landlines because those lines had their
I saw
own
things out
independent
there.
power source.
Things you wouldn't
But
believe.
here is what has changed. The
And nobody
telecommunications
else
industry
seemed to
has
care.
spent the last 15 years migrating customers from traditional copper infrastructure to voice over internet protocol systems. VoIP, which route calls through the internet. VoIP phones require household power and an active internet connection. When the grid goes down and the router dies, VoIP phones die with them. If your home phone service is bundled with your cable or
You see the
internet
stark
package,
difference in the approach
it is
they took.
almost certainly VoIP.
One was cautious,
That means in a grid
the other
failure,
far
your
too
landline
aggressive.
is not actually a backup to
Still
your cell
nothing.
phone. They fail for different reasons, but they both fail.
Dead.
The
Everything
Federal
is dead.
Communications Commission has raised concerns about this exact gap in residential emergency communications capacity, noting that the transition away from copper infrastructure
I saw
has
what they
reduced
did.
the resilience of home telephone service during
And
power
there's no
emergencies.
going back from that.
Understanding which infrastructure your phone actually runs on is not a small detail. It is the kind of thing that matters the night you cannot reach anyone. Number 5 is heating. And in cold weather regions, this is the item on this list that moves from serious to life-threatening faster than any other. Natural gas furnaces, the most common residential heating system in the northern United States, require electricity to power the blower motor, the igniter, the thermostat, and the control board. Without grid power, the furnace cannot operate, regardless of whether gas is still flowing. Electric heat pumps and electric baseboard heaters obviously stop entirely when the power cuts. Kerosene and propane space heaters can provide supplemental warmth without electricity, but they require fuel, proper ventilation, and carbon monoxide awareness. Fireplaces can help but have limited reach in large homes and require having dry wood available in advance. The rate at which an unheated house loses temperature depends on insulation quality, outside temperature, and wind. But in seriously cold conditions, below 20 degrees Fahrenheit
It's getting
outside,
colder.
poorly insulated homes can see interior temperatures drop
Just
to
hold
dangerous
on.
levels within 12 to 18 hours. The 2021 Texas winter storm killed at least 246 people, with hypothermia and carbon monoxide poisoning from improper indoor heating accounting for a significant portion of those deaths. Many of those victims were people who had never needed to think about heating their homes without electricity because Texas winters had never before demanded it. A single storm changed the parameters of what was possible in under 48 hours, with no warning. The coldest part of a winter blackout is not the first night. It is the second morning when the house has had 18 hours to lose whatever warmth it stored. That is when the math becomes dangerous. Number 4 is the medical equipment ecosystem, and it is the item on this list that is most likely to affect someone in your household directly without you initially connecting it to the blackout. Consider the range of ordinary medical devices that run on household current. CPAP and BiPAP machines used by millions of Americans for sleep apnea and respiratory conditions. Home oxygen concentrators prescribed for people with chronic lung disease. Electric hospital beds used by elderly or mobility-limited family members. Motorized wheelchairs and scooters that require regular charging. Home dialysis equipment. Nebulizers for asthma and respiratory conditions. And insulin that requires refrigeration
to
to
know the
remain
truth.
viable. Each of these represents a category where the
burden of
loss of
that
power
falls on
is
us
not an
now.
inconvenience. It is a medical
You
event.
need to understand something.
The CPAP situation alone is worth understanding in
This is
detail.
the truth.
The American Academy of Sleep Medicine estimates that approximately 30 million Americans have sleep apnea, and of those, millions use CPAP therapy every night. A single night without that equipment is unpleasant. Multiple nights can cause significant cardiovascular and cognitive strain in patients with moderate to severe apnea. Most users have never investigated whether their device has a battery backup option, and most have not discussed an outage plan with their healthcare provider. Many CPAP models are compatible with small external battery packs that can power the device for 1 to 3 nights, depending on settings. That knowledge costs nothing to have and can make an enormous difference during a 3-day outage. The broader principle here is that power-dependent medical equipment should be mapped in advance. Every device, its power requirement, its runtime on battery backup if available, and what the plan is when it runs out. Number 3 is food safety, and not in the way most people think about it. The conversation about refrigerators and blackouts usually centers on the 4-hour rule. The USDA guideline that a full, closed refrigerator will keep food safe for approximately 4 hours during an outage. That rule is real and it is useful. But it applies to the refrigerator compartment specifically, under specific conditions, including keeping the door closed. What most people do not appreciate is what happens after those 4 hours, and what happens in the freezer on a different timeline. A full freezer will hold safe temperatures for 48 hours if kept closed. A half-full freezer holds for approximately 24. Those windows matter because they determine your decision timeline. If you consume or relocate perishables from the refrigerator in the first 4 hours, and you do not open the freezer unnecessarily, you have bought yourself potentially 2 days of safe frozen food.
Lose all the cold.
Most families waste that window by opening both compartments repeatedly in the first few hours to check on things or retrieve items, accelerating temperature loss. But here is the deeper issue. Spoiled food is not always visually identifiable. Meat that smells slightly off. Leftovers that look fine but have been in the temperature danger zone for hours. These are the vectors through which foodborne illness enters the picture. The CDC estimates that 48 million Americans experience foodborne illness each year. And power outage contamination is a documented contributor, particularly in the aftermath of major weather events, when people are already under physical stress and consuming foods they might otherwise discard. A simple food thermometer, inexpensive, battery-free, and available at any grocery store, is the only reliable way to assess whether food is still safe when you cannot trust visual or olfactory cues alone.
Right, so it's ready.
During a blackout, a thermometer is not a kitchen gadget.
You are one of
It
two
is
options.
a health tool.
Which
Number
one
2 is one that
is up to
nobody
you?
puts on these lists. And it is the one that reshapes everything else once it is gone. It is running water, not the water itself, but the pressure system that delivers it to your taps. In most American homes connected to a municipal water supply, water pressure is maintained by electric pumps at the treatment facility and at booster stations throughout the distribution network. In a localized outage, municipal water often remains pressurized because the grid failure does not extend to the utility's own backup systems. But in a widespread, extended regional blackout, the kind caused by major infrastructure damage, municipal water systems can lose pressure within hours to days as backup generators exhaust their fuel. Homes on private well systems are even more directly affected. Well pumps are electric.
No.
And when the power cuts, they stop immediately.
No, not again.
No pump, no water at any tap
no.
in the house. No water for drinking, cooking, flushing toilets, washing hands, or any other domestic purpose.
Each of these
FEMA
jugs
recommends
represents a
storing a
full day's
minimum of
necessary
1 gallon
water
of
for a
water per
family.
person per day
Holding
for
this weight
drinking
puts
and
into
basic
perspective the
sanitation,
daily challenge.
with a 3-day minimum supply and a 2-week supply as a more robust target for extended emergencies. Most households store none. The 2017 Hurricane Maria aftermath saw many Puerto Rican communities lose running water for weeks or months, as infrastructure damage compounded the grid failure. The public health consequences, gastrointestinal illness, dehydration,
prioritize the
inability
oxygen
to
tanks
maintain
coming in.
basic sanitation in
flag the
medical
incoming
settings
shipment should be
were
here by
severe
nightfall.
and well documented. Running water is so automatic,
I saw what they did.
so invisibly reliable in ordinary American life
And I know
that
the
most
truth.
families have genuinely never thought about what happens to daily life the moment it is not there.
Still nothing.
What happens is that everything
Yeah.
else on this list becomes dramatically
too
harder
long.
to manage. Number 1 is not a piece of
The
equipment.
time
It is not something
is
you can go
now.
out and buy. It is the thing that fails silently,
Number 1.
invisibly, before the
I
blackout
saw
even
things
begins,
that night.
and whose
no
absence
one
becomes
should ever
impossible
have
to
to
ignore
witness.
once the power has been out for more than 12 hours. Number 1
And that
is
is
the
the
plan
absolute
itself.
truth, I can promise
Not
you
just
that.
any plan. The shared, communicated, understood by everyone
check
in the
the batteries
household
on the
plan
list?
for what
Yes,
happens
they are
when
in
the
the go
power
bag
goes
already.
out
I'm
and
checking the
does
water
not
now.
come back quickly. Research on household disaster preparedness is uncomfortably consistent on this point. A 2019 survey conducted by the American Red Cross found that while the majority of American adults expressed concern about being prepared for emergencies, fewer than half had developed a household emergency plan, and fewer than 20% had taken concrete steps to document and practice that plan with their family. FEMA's own preparedness research shows similar
think it's
patterns.
coming back on?
Families know they should have a plan. Most do not have one. And
don't
the
know what to
absence of a
do.
plan is not neutral. It has a specific cost that plays out in real time during an emergency, when there is no predetermined answer to questions like, where does everyone go if we need to leave? How do we reach each other if cell service is down? Who is responsible for the medical equipment? Where are the documents we might need?
There's nothing in here.
What are we eating
the top
tomorrow and the day
cabinets
after?
What is this?
Those questions
Anything?
have to be answered under stress, in the dark, possibly with frightened children or elderly family members present, possibly while
We have to
something
do
else
this.
is
There's no other
simultaneously
choice.
going
No, I
wrong.
won't. I'm telling you, it's
That
too
is when people
dangerous.
make the mistakes
But we're
they
out
later
of
describe
options.
as
Find
panic.
another one.
They are
I'm
not
done.
panicking because they are weak. They are panicking because they are making decisions cold that should have been made warm weeks or months earlier, with time and resources
door.
available. The plan is number
Sump
one
pump.
because everything else on this list,
Water heater.
the garage door, the sump pump,
heat.
the water heater,
medical
the
equipment.
heat, the medical
Food.
equipment, the food,
Water.
the water.
And that is why
Every single
moving
one of those
forward,
challenges
we
becomes
must
manageable
all
with a plan
work
in
together
place
to
and becomes
ensure
significantly
this
more
outcome.
dangerous without one. Here is what the families who navigate extended blackouts successfully tend to have in common. They did not prepare because they were
Emergency
afraid.
power source
They
checked.
prepared because they understood
Good.
that preparation
Now
and
let's check
panic
the water
exist in
purification
inverse
filters.
proportion to
Right,
each other.
that's on page 4.
The more genuinely ready a household is, the
You know, I've
calmer it
seen
is
things
when
out
something
there
goes
that
wrong.
most
Calm
people
is
wouldn't
not a
believe.
personality trait in those moments. It is the product of decisions that were made before the crisis required them.
You just need to know how to listen
The
to the
families
silence.
still standing in the dark trying to figure out what to do next are not worse people. They just had less information, or they assumed there would be more time. There is always less time than expected. The outages that last 3 days never announce themselves as 3-day outages. They arrive as 2-hour outages that keep extending. By the time the scope becomes clear, the window for easy preparation has already closed. The 10 things in this video stop working in roughly the order they were presented. Some of them you can do nothing about once the power is gone, but all of them, every single one, can be accounted for, planned around, and managed
The time for
if the work
deliberation has
happens before the
passed.
lights go out.
We must act
The
now
pantry
with
question
courage
follows
and
directly
conviction
from this.
for a better future.
Because once your home systems are understood and planned for, the next question is whether what is in your kitchen can actually sustain your family through
You
the
learn to
window
let go of the things you
those
can't
plans
control and
are
you focus
designed to
on what's
cover.
real. This
That
journey is
question
about accepting
has
yourself,
its own answer.
flaws and all, and moving
And
forward.
that answer deserves its own conversation.